Many of you will have been looking at the BESA barometers over the last couple of quarters. As you know, BESA does quarterly barometers on head teachers' outlook for what their education budgets are going to look like over the next year. And we know that following the Brexit votes, we have seen year-on-year declines in projected expenditure across the board, with a small exception of assessments. But this session is not to drill down into education. It's actually to take a step back from education for a minute and really look at the economy more broadly, because I'm sure the vote to leave the EU caught many of you in this room, as it did myself and probably many of the people on the panel, by surprise, as it did many of the world's economists, politicians and economic officials. Certainly in the run-up to the Brexit votes, voters were told that leaving the EU would hit the UK economy hard, with the only question really being around what future arrangements might be made with the EU. And we still have very little clarity really about what those arrangements might look like. What I'm keen to do in this panel is to ask some key questions more broadly around what the future for the economy is post-Brexit. When it comes to future prosperity, is there too much focus on the UK's status within Europe? When the economy is performing better than expected, the UK's finances still look quite weak. And actually one of the things that certainly I know Phil Mullan has been doing some ongoing work on is a discussion around the lack of productivity in the economy more broadly. So should we be drilling down into that? And also our Brexit research that we've been undertaking with members since the votes suggests that there is a strong sense from education suppliers quite broadly that we shouldn't just be focusing on negotiations with the EU, but also with the rest of the world as well, and that negotiations with the EU shouldn't overshadow the opportunity to build relations with the US, Australia, the Middle East, Asia and China in particular is cited. So what does the future hold, and what kind of deals should the UK aim to strike with the EU? And when most economists, officials and business leaders predicted disaster if there was a vote to leave the EU, is it any surprise that the initial reaction to the vote has been to dent business confidence? I'm delighted that we've got a very prestigious panel of speakers to comment on this. Speaking first will be, to my far right, Andrew Smith, Chief Economic Advisor to the Industry Forum, an independent organisation which promotes constructive dialogue between policymakers, business and leading commentators. He's worked extensively in financial markets and business services, latterly as Chief Economist at KPMG, and prior to that as Chief Economist and Investment Strategist at a major international bank. Speaking second, to my immediate left, is Rosa Wilkinson, who's recently joined the new Department for International Trade to lead engagement with business and other stakeholders on trade policy issues. And Rosa's been working very closely with BESA over the last few months to take on board the inputs that many of you will have given to our consultation. She joins the department from the Intellectual Property Office, and previous roles have included working with UKTI, leading work to market the UK internationally, and as Director of Public Policy for Lloyd's TSB. So, Rosa, thank you very much for joining us. To my far left, probably not politically, but certainly in terms of where you sit, we have Sam Bowman, who's the Executive Director of the Adam Smith Institute, responsible for managing the Institute's team on a daily basis, working on the ASI's over strategy, and being a media spokesman for the ASA. And many of you will have seen Sam both on radio and national television. He's interested in the political economy of what he calls bleeding heart libertarianism, a school of thought that tries to use free market policies to improve the welfare of the poor. And then finally, to my immediate right, we have Phil Mullan, who's an economist and business manager, author of the fantastic read, The Imaginary Time Bomb, Why an Ageing Population is Not a Social Problem. He researches, writes and lectures on economic, demographic and business issues. And your next book, Creative Destruction, How to Start an Economic Renaissance, will be published in March 2017. He's currently Director of Epping Consulting and was previously at EasyNet Global Services, and before that was CEO of internet services and training company Cyber Cafe, which opened the world's first internet cafe, Siberia, in 1994. So we have a great panel of speakers. Each is going to speak for about 3 to 5 minutes. We're then going to go out and take rounds of questions and come back to the panel. But without further ado from me, I'd like to hand over to Andrew.
Well, good afternoon. Rather ambitiously, I thought I'd make a few remarks about the process of Brexit, about trade negotiations and about the economy in 3 to 5 minutes. So this is going to be a bit bullet pointy. Point 1. Brexit's going to be complicated, drawn out and risky because the interests of us and the EU are not aligned. Point 2, Article 50 deliberations are basically mainly about the terms of the divorce from the EU, not about our future trade relations. Liam Fox has suggested that actually the two can run in parallel, all be done and dusted in 2 years. It'll all be over. Most people don't think that'll happen, so we may well need some sort of interim agreement after we've left to tide us over till we can negotiate a proper agreement. And any deal will involve trade-offs. As everybody knows, it's about access to the single market versus free movement and also contributions to the EU budget. We might actually end up with no access at all in the tariff war if we're not careful. So a huge range of outcomes. And there's also the issue of third countries. As you know, Liam Fox is very keen to get flying around the world negotiating trade deals. I think it's very unlikely anybody who wants to negotiate seriously with us until they know what deal we've come to with the EU. So all this is putting things forward, I'd thought 5 to 10 years before we really know where we're going. In terms of negotiations themselves, it's actually the case that we need the EU more than the EU needs us. 50% of our exports go to the EU, that represents 12% of our GDP. EU exports to the UK about 3% of their GDP, so if push comes to the shove, they can be nastier than we can. There's also something called a gravity models of world trade. They suggest that naturally you will trade with big markets which are close to you, so the idea we can make up for any losses in trade with the EU by going to the other side of the world, we're going very much against the grain, and actually it's pretty difficult to do. And the UK is particularly vulnerable in all this because of our huge reliance on services, and certainly service exports as well to the EU. And the big problem with service exports is they actually depend on free movement, basically. If you're a lawyer, you want to go there to do the job. So that's particularly awkward for us, I think. And I think the other point which people seem to be forgetting is successful trade negotiations are really about what you've got to offer other people, not what you're going to demand from them. So if, for example, we decided we wanted to have some sort of special deal for auto manufacturers and the city, I think we have to think carefully about what we'd want to be prepared to give the EU in return. And I've got no idea, but if I was a farmer, I think I might be a bit worried at this point. And in terms of dealing with the rest of the world, we're really not on the radar in terms of trade deals these days. The trade deals are about big blocks, 300, 400, 500 consumer markets. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think China and India are particularly interested anyway, unless they can get a quick deal which gives them a lot more than they're prepared to give the other side. As you might have gathered, I'm not particularly optimistic about all this. As far as the economy is concerned, nothing's happened yet, but we've already seen, in terms of Brexit, but we've already seen the pound down. To some extent, that will be good for exporters, bad for everybody else in the economy. Rising inflation, higher inflation is going to squeeze our incomes and our consumer spending. But I think the real concern is permanent damage to the UK's long-term growth potential and living standards. The things which drive growth in the economy, investment, exports and labour supply, all of which are threatened by Brexit negotiations. So unless something miraculous happens, I think we'll all be poorer than we otherwise would be. Public finances will be even weaker and public services spending will be stressed even more.
A nice rosy start to the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Let's follow it up with a Rosa response, shall we? So much for a rosy start. My job, actually, and the job of those who sit around me within the new Department for International Trade, is to make sure that the future outlook is rather different to that one, Andrew. And actually, I think that there is the potential to make sure that it is. What do I see from my eyrie on Victoria Street? Well, I see quite a lot of stuff happening. First of all, I do see an awful lot of people, despite what Andrew says, coming forward and saying that they want to talk to the UK. They know that at the moment, the rules of our EU membership mean that we cannot begin any formal negotiations. And I think you're right. To some extent, they will want to see how those begin to pan out before they think about any deal they might do with us. But in fact, they are stepping forward to say, let's make sure that we've got all of the information we need in all of the channels we need it, such that When the starting pistol is fired, we can get going. We can start discussions properly on trade deals that actually make sense for us, the bilateral partner, and for the UK. Now, there you come into an interesting question, and that one is proximity, and you raise that quite sensibly. I think one of the things that we can look towards in our post-Brexit economy is a trading landscape which is not as limited to the EU as it has been in some quarters. If I think about all of the businesses to whom I've spoken since I moved into the Department for International Trade, the overwhelming majority of them tell me that between 45 and 55% of their trade is done with the EU. There is no doubt in my mind that the EU markets will continue to be a cash cow for the UK. They are familiar, even if they don't necessarily speak the same language. They are an environment that we are used to doing business with. That ain't going to go away, and by God, we've got to make sure that we get the best possible deal as we go through our exit negotiations. And Andrew, you're right, it's not going to be plain sailing. It will be tough, but we'll bloody well do it. However, the one thing that I can say with absolute certainty is that we are going to want to and need to look further afield. We are going to want to try and capture some of those interesting growth markets. Because there is a second message that's coming from many of the businesses that I'm talking to. Yes, Rosa, the EU is our cash cow. My language, not theirs, if I'm brutally honest. But actually, we don't see much growth there. We see a bit of stagnation. We don't see our prospects increasing. What we do see, if you, Department for International Trade, gets its finger out and gets things right, is real opportunity in, yes, China, yes, India, yes, some parts of South America, and other markets which are beginning to emerge as significant economic powers. I think that that's right. I think that we will have to make sure that we get the terms of any deals that we do with those markets right. And we know from past experience that it will not always be easy. So one thing that I certainly see in my immediate future is that I will be embracing my title as Director of Engagement, or more properly called Director of Listening to People, to make sure that we pin our lugs back and listen to what your needs and concerns are as we begin to enter those markets. I think that there's a final thing that I would add. I think that you will see a centre of government that is a bit sharper on the uptake in terms of what businesses need. One thing that is common right across the economic departments is a recognition that one thing we've absolutely got to do is make sure the platform from which you trade at home is the right one for your businesses. That cuts right across the whole landscape of what the regulatory framework looks like, and of course fiscal policy that underpins it.
Thank you very much, Rose. Over to you, Sam.
Thanks, Patrick. There's a story that I will open with from ancient China of an executioner who had to kind of lop the heads off his master's enemies so many times that he got so good at it that he was able to slice somebody's head off so cleanly that the head stayed on. And the guy, all his veins and nerves and so on were still in the right place. So he said, "Oh, you torture me, Weng Cheng." And Weng Cheng said, "Kindly nod," and the head falls off. And when we look at the global economy and think about the kind of effects of Brexit on the global economy, and we think, you know what, it has not been so bad. I say, look to the presidential election and kindly nod. I think that we're still really trying to interpret the signs of Brexit. And this is kind of what I want to talk about today, because really what we've seen is two very countervailing or seemingly countervailing trends. One is the massive loss in value of the pound, about 20% compared to the dollar, an all-time low compared to a reasonable basket of currencies, the Wall Street Journal's basket of currencies, which is a sign of perhaps two things. On the other hand, reasonably strong GDP growth in the 3 months after Brexit. If you believe in reasonably efficient markets, like I do, you would have expected investment to fall immediately after the Brexit vote, and you would have expected consumer spending to fall immediately after the Brexit vote, neither of which seems to have happened. So what's going on here? When it comes to the pound, there are two countervailing, or there are two trends that could cause the pound to weaken relative to our other currencies. The first is that markets expect monetary policy to become easier. They expect the Bank of England, as it more or less has done, to announce rate cuts, more quantitative easing, and a commitment to keeping inflation above the 2% medium-term target. Mark Carney's sort of maintenance in the job, I think, is an indication that we're expecting to see more easy policy for the next couple of years at least. The other is that there should be a real terms devaluation, and I think this is more likely to be the reason for the drop in the pound after Brexit, which is that if you think of every pound as a claim on a tiny fraction of every possible investment opportunity in Britain, a devaluation in the purchasing power of the pound reflects a lower profit return on every potential investment opportunity in Britain. And that, I think, is the reason that we saw the pound drop significantly after Brexit. So that's not a good thing. I'm not persuaded that the pound dropping is good overall, even though it's good for exporters. Really, I mean, as Adam Smith himself noted, the point of exports is to get imports. And when we export more and import less, that maybe seems like it's good on a ledger sheet for our exporters, but really we're getting less overall, we're poorer overall. So I'm not convinced that that's a good thing. But it's an interesting indication of the future. GDP growth, on the other hand, is also something that we should look at. It's also something we should take seriously, and GDP growth has been pretty good. So what's going on? What's the difference? I think the lesson from the most recent GDP figures, and we have to bear in mind it's 1 quarter of growth, we can't look into it too much, is that aggregate supply uncertainty, that is, not knowing where we should be putting our investment, not knowing where businesses will be able to sell their money, is less important than perhaps we once thought, is less important than perhaps we thought before the Brexit referendum. Aggregate demand uncertainty, I think, is still very important, but the Bank of England stepping up and kind of pledging to keep the pound relatively cheap, I think has probably offset that. But a lot depends now. I think uncertainty has been sort of taken out of the equation. A lot now depends, obviously, on the deal that we get. And the way to think about this, and the way to think about the importance of the deal, is about a process of time, of change, because a lot of people who are very enthusiastic about Brexit, and there are quite a lot of them who know what they're talking about, point to the fact that Canada, Japan, the US, none of them are in the EU, but they're all quite rich. Some of them are richer than we are. The problem is, and I don't think there's any reason to think that we couldn't be like that as well, the problem is that there's a process of change that takes place to get from where we are to where they are. No matter what happens, and the NISA report that's been reported in the FT today, it'll be out tomorrow, I've been looking at it today, suggests that there could be an up to 60% reduction in services exports from the UK overall, not just to the EU, but in total. What that means is that even though we could be much richer in 10 or 15 or 20 years, is that a lot of businesses that currently exist need to be effectively liquidated, or a lot of their actions or activities need to be effectively liquidated because they can't continue to trade on the same basis. And that takes a lot of time to change, and that's a very costly process. It's not something we want to do. So there might be a sectoral shift, but it's not going to come easily, and it's not going to come quickly. So where are the opportunities? There's trade. To be completely honest, I'm not that optimistic about that. TTIP is the biggest trade deal in the world at the moment. If we got a TTIP level for trade deal with the US, it would mean 0.5 percentage point of GDP on most estimates. That's not very much compared to what we're losing as we leave the EU, no matter what kind of trade deal we get. We might deregulate, but I'm not very optimistic about that. I would love to know from Brexiteers what deregulations they have in mind when they say we could be much richer by deregulating. The one opportunity I do see, and I know I have to finish up now, is completely unrelated political shifts in Britain happening because of Brexit. Now, these might be good, they might be bad. Where they could be good would be tax reform, a shift from capital taxation to consumption taxation, planning reform, a shift from very strict controls on how we use land to allowing more freedom over that, or to change our approach to labour regulation to make things like the gig economy, the sort of Uber Deliveroo style approach to labour, much more informal approach, the norm. Now, I don't see that we're going in the right direction in any of those respects. Perhaps that will change, but that is where the greatest gains or the greatest losses will come from Brexit, in my opinion.
Thank you very much, Sam. And last but not least, Phil.
Good afternoon. Well, I'm going to start my 5 minutes 3,500 years ago, roughly, which is when nomads in the place we today call the Middle East domesticated the camel as a very fuel-efficient, beast of burden. And it's from then that foreign trade really began and pretty much grew pretty consistently ever since. People have therefore been trading internationally for several millennia, long before we had complex trading agreements, and I think a few years before we had European single market. So the first of my 3 points is that while we need camels or horses and carts or ships or airplanes as absolutely necessary for trade, you don't need to be a member of a particular formal trading arrangement to be able to trade with it. For example, Britain trades without being part of NAFTA, without being part of the North American Free Trade Agreement, trades with Mexico, trades with America, trades with Canada. Or look at the 3 major exporters into the rather more protectionist European single market. That's China, the United States, and Russia, none of which have got formal trade agreements with the EU. So to be a successful exporter, much more important than trade deals, is to be able to produce goods and services efficiently so that you're competitive internationally. The primary reason that Britain doesn't sell a lot more into Mexico and the United States and Canada isn't because it's not in NAFTA, but because it doesn't produce enough things competitively enough, which leads to my second point. And here I switch animals, if you can follow, from camels to elephants. Right, because there is an elephant in the British economy room, and this has nothing to do with Brexit, nor does it have much to do with membership of the European Union. And that is the elephant that Britain is nowhere near productive enough either to trade successfully or, even more importantly, to sustain decent living standards for all of us. Effectively, I'd say we're stuck in a depression here, characterized by low levels of business investment, characterized by abysmal productivity performance. I mean, most of us have read and know that productivity in Britain has been pretty much stagnant, flatlining since 2008. But Britain also has a productivity gap, a shortfall, compared with most of the developed world, and including that, most European countries. Productivity levels in Britain are 45% below Holland, 35% below Germany, 30% below France and Ireland, and by the way, below the United States, and even 10% below Italy and 5% below Spain. So we got a productivity problem in Britain, much more. Thirdly, my conclusion from these 2 points is that Britain's future economic prospects, and that's our subject matter today, the title, our future prospects and prosperity will be much more influenced by dealing with the productivity challenge than focusing on Britain's future formal trading relationship with the EU. In fact, whatever the various anti-Brexit economic models and the pro-Brexit economic models, of which there were a few as well, but not many, Brexit, I would argue, will have no definitive, predetermined effect on the economy, bad or good, because the economic future depends much more primarily on domestic policies and actions yet to be undertaken. This perspective brings us to a danger, not with Brexit itself, but I think with the economic discussion about Brexit and the ubiquity of that discussion. Because in the past 4 months, I think we've developed something like a Brexit mania when it comes to economic discussion, a Brexit obsession, where we see everything economic through Brexit-tinted lenses. And I think this is getting in the way of seeing where the problems really lie. So, for example, Sam talked about the sterling's big depreciation over recent months. That, of course, as he presented it and others have, is seen as a Brexit story. Even though the IMF and others have for years been saying the pound is grossly overvalued, and on the basis of capital flows coming in for various reasons, property and otherwise. So when exaggerated Brexit anxieties brought about, and has brought about, that 15-20% fall in the overvalued pound, Brexit is blamed rather than seeing that the depreciation is a symptom of Britain's prolonged lack of competitiveness, as we see expressed in 30 years now of balance of payments deficits, right, since the mid-1980s. In short then, Brexit has become the number one economic issue we are supposed to focus on, whereas we, and I think even more importantly our politicians, should be concentrating most of their economic attention on doing something to stir up productivity growth, to shake up our zombie-like economy and promote much more investment in innovation, in technology and in science and so on. Success in this would have much more bearing upon our economic prospects, upon Britain's economic prospects, including upon its trading success or otherwise, than the various trade agreements it either negotiates or possibly fails to negotiate with the EU and its other global trading partners. To conclude, the very last thing Britain needs is for the politicians, I would argue, to minimise or seek to minimise the impact of the referendum vote in an attempt to preserve the status quo. because the status quo we have in economic terms is a dismal status quo. We need change. Instead, we should be embracing the economic opportunities that arise both from responding to all the changes which will be forced upon us by Brexit, inevitable changes, but also the opportunities arising from the greater freedoms in economic policy that will ensue from getting out of the clutches of EU rules and regulations and the various other uncontrollable impositions that it makes upon us and its other members.
Thank you very much, Phil. I think at this point we could just give a brief round of applause to all the speakers. Yes. Now I've got lots of questions myself, but I'm very keen to make this as conversational as possible. So if we have some points on the floor.
It's interesting, we're doing business mostly outside the EU around the rest of the world, and it's amazing to me how often people raise the Brexit topic with me. I'm interested in your views about the extent to which the Brexit vote and the public discussion and the political dialogue that followed it is likely to change sentiment towards the UK, and what impact that change in sentiment might have on people's willingness to trade with us as a partner.
The last speaker and the points made were very eloquent, but having spoken to people that I know that in universities and things like that, funding has been pulled already for large projects, and lots of funding has already left the UK. So how does the panel propose, if we are going to improve productivity within the UK, how does the panel propose that they might be able to achieve that, rather than focusing on all of the Brexit and the media and rhetoric around that?
Thanks very much. I'll go to Caroline Wright.
Thank you. A comment, first of all, just thank you to Rosa on behalf of BESA members, because as soon as the Brexit vote had happened, very, very shortly after, Rosa and her team were canvassing and asking for views from industry and have had an open door towards us, and I think that's very, very helpful in terms of being able to get some insights into how you're planning to take forward negotiations, which gives me a lot of confidence actually in terms of that our voice is being heard. Kind of an observation, I've now been in a number of different countries since the Brexit vote, and having listened to the panel, I agree there are lots and lots of challenges. There are also opportunities. Our education system, the British education system, and our exports is something that's really, really valued internationally and not necessarily linked to Europe. So we have our cultural and trading links with Europe, but our exports, people want to buy British educational supplies. They're not necessarily linked to the European education system, which is a real positive. The question, it's really helpful to hear about what we think government needs to do and what government is doing. What would your one piece of advice, each of you, be towards the companies in this room? What can they do to weather the storm or maximise the opportunities?
Thanks very much. I'm going to take two more and then come back to the panel.
Just a question about productivity, which I thought was really interesting. Generally interested in the views of the panel about how the education system should change, if it should, that might lead to increases in productivity. You talk to employers, they say young people are coming out of education without the skills we need. You talk to the government, and they say we're wedded to the back in the national curriculum. What would your advice be in terms of increasing productivity via the education system?
Thank you very much. Lewis.
What does the panel think are the prospects for public spending in the short and medium term? Do you think that the Chancellor will be delivering stimulus to the economy through increasing public spending, or are we in for much more austerity?
Thanks very much. Right. If I could go to you, Sam, first, and then I'm going to work my way along this way. So, Sam.
Sure. Just on the point that Phil made about the IMF predicting that the pound was overvalued and so on, I think the idea of a balance of payments imbalance, or a long-term one, is just it misunderstands why a balance of payments exists. The reason the UK has had a very large balance of payments imbalance is that the UK is a very attractive place to invest, not just because we have productive firms, although obviously we do, but because we have a lot of very, very valuable fixed capital like housing and so on. I just think it's ludicrous to think that people who have money could have said before the pound fell that the pound will fall by this much, and yet they didn't put any of their money in. They didn't short the pound. They didn't buy other currencies, but they were just standing on the sidelines saying this would happen. And secondly, I think it's ludicrous to say that the pound falling 20% in the 5 or 6 hours after the Brexit vote had nothing to do with Brexit. That was just a coincidence, and that Brexit was just the straw that broke the camel's back. I mean, be realistic here. We understand why these things happen. On the productivity point, I think the single thing I would say to the government is productivity is a function of labour and capital. And in the UK, we do have problems on the labour side, but that's much harder politically to deal with. The very, very important thing that we have not dealt with is land. The Financial Times, Chris Giles did a fantastic kind of series of pieces last year on the many, many restrictions, not just in terms of housing, but in terms of how businesses can use land and how quickly it is to register land and switch it from different uses and so on. The one thing I would do if I was the government would be to change and very heavily deregulate how you can use land within urban areas. That's a much less hot political potato than converting the greenbelt and so on. In terms of spending plans, I suspect what we will see is rhetorically a move away from austerity, because I think that this government, the May government, wants to make a break with the Osborne government. I suspect they will do that by announcing what seem like quite high-profile infrastructure projects, but I also suspect the spending for those will be spread over 4 years and actually will amount to not very much. I think that's probably a good thing, because infrastructure spending isn't actually a very good way of stimulating the economy, even if you subscribe to the kind of Keynesian view that monetary policy is ineffective. But that's my prediction. In actual fact, there won't be a huge change from the plan. We obviously won't have anything like a budget surplus, but we won't move away from austerity in the long term. But we will rhetorically see lots and lots of new small motorways here and there announced, and the electrification of railways and things like that, which are probably good in cost-benefit terms, but certainly not important in a macroeconomic sense.
Thanks, Sam. Rosa.
Well, let's start with that. Will the Brexit vote change sentiment towards the UK? For me, the sort of chicken-licking response to the referendum that the sky is falling in is having a ripple effect. I think we've got over it here within the UK and people are getting on with the knitting again, but actually it's rippling out a bit. And I think that certainly the messages that I'm getting from businesses is that they are seeing more concern about doing business with the UK than they did hitherto. Personally, I think it's a flash in the pan. I think it is a ripple that will dissipate. I really do think it will. There are things that are not helpful. I know that if you talk to institutional investors in the States at the moment, they are worried that because of the the Brexit vote, we will see a second Scottish referendum, and that is making them more worried about investing here in the UK. I think that those are issues that will go, but not quickly. The second thing that I see is that some of our sister trade associations in mainland Europe and elsewhere picked up on some of our ministerial comments in the immediate aftermath of the referendum and thought, okay, the UK is going to strip away all manner of regulation, become some sort of strange, hyper-competitive rogue nation that doesn't give squat diddly for protection of consumers or the environment or data or anything else. It is, of course, absolute rubbish. I usually spell rubbish with a B and the 2 L's in the middle and a K at the end, but it's absolute nonsense. We are going to continue to be a responsible regulatory environment, and I think for that reason they will come back to recognising that the UK is a great, great place to do business. In terms of funding for productivity, I don't know is the honest answer, but I do recognise that at this moment, actually, we've got an opportunity to encourage people within government and our ministerial leaders to perhaps think about the framework of business support and encouragement that they deliver in different ways. And that comes back to the point that I was making in my opening remarks about making sure that we have a genuinely competitive environment and then using that to improve productivity and succeed. Caroline, thank you for your comments about us being engaging. I do try to be engaging. I note the comment that you make about ops not being all about Europe. In fact, the conversation that we had showed that some of the South American opportunities there, if we can just deal with some of the tariff structures that exist at the moment. And I think that we've got an opportunity to do that as we step away from Europe that we haven't had in the past. If I had one bit of advice for business, it's actually don't restrict yourselves. Think about the opportunities beyond your usual frame. Don't sweat trying to grow something that has reached its peak. Have a look at other opportunities, but recognise you're going to have to invest in doing that. Education changes. Haven't got a clue. I'm not in education. Prospect for public spending. Haven't got a clue, even if I did, wouldn't say because it might be misinterpreted, but interesting to see some of the comments about stepping away from austerity targets and already around some of the infrastructure spending. How was that for speed?
Thank you very much. Very good. Phil, over to you.
Okay, picking up on what, or pursuing what Rosa said about the sentiment to us from outside, I think that will depend. I think people are waiting to see, to some extent. It'll depend on the words and the actions which are taken over the next period as to whether Britain comes across as being a open and potentially a more competitive place. In that respect, I think the Tory party conference was pretty appalling in terms of the message that was given there. You can say it's just playing to her crowd or whatever, but these things are picked up. And I think if that message were to be pursued, which was anti-business, isolationist, anti-foreigner, if that's the message which is turned into actions by a government which, by the way, most of its cabinet were for remaining in, they're not a leaving cabinet. If the government were to continue in that vein, then I think the overseas attitudes to us would be very poorly impaired. So in that respect, I think the Brexit debate has still got to go on to challenge that sort of isolationism and narrowness, and to put forward the positive ways in which we can actually seize the opportunities. Science funding, or funding to universities, I can say a couple of words on that, because I think that to me symbolises the problem in the discussion that we're having. I think universities, research bodies, scientists are quite right to be furious about the low level of funding for research and development. But I think they're entirely wrong to put the focus of that on Brussels, right? Because it has been British governments of all complexions which have been cutting back funding for R&D, for research and development, over the last 30 years, right? There's not been any particular party that has done that. They've all done it. And the amounts that have been cut back dwarf the amount of money which comes from funding from the EU. And the EU fund, by the way, Horizon 2020 is not money which is manufactured in Brussels, of course. There's no money tree in Brussels. It is taxpayers' money from us here, which goes to stop off in Brussels and comes back to our universities and our science institutions and our research institutions and so on. So the anger should be against British governments which have cut back funding from about 0.9% of GDP, won't go into too many figures, to 0.5% now, which is okay, that doesn't sound a lot. It's about 5, if we were to go back to where we were 25, 30 years ago, it would be an extra 5 billion invested. And the amount of money you get via the Brussels trajectory at the moment is about 6, 7, 800 million. So we should see things in perspective in this respect. Be angry about the shortage of funding, but the problem is at home in terms of British government successfully not investing in the future. I gather you want to shut me up, so I will...
Only because time is limited. Yeah. Phil, thank you. Andrew.
Well, as far as Greg's first question was concerned, I was thinking that much more in a sort of European context. I think what people in power over here say actually matters to a lot of our European politicians over there, and it is not going down terribly well when people are making very strange remarks about it. In terms of the rest of the world, I'm not actually so worried in the sense that I think if we ever get to... trade negotiations are basically very hard-headed things, and I don't think it's going to worry trade negotiators what we're saying. They'll just know what they want to get. The productivity puzzle, I agree entirely with Phil that one of the big puzzles to me has been why the government has insisted on focusing on something which doesn't really matter, called the deficit, when the obvious big problem the UK economy's got is we're not producing enough. And if we could get productivity up a couple of percent, a lot of the other problems would just disappear. So I'm puzzled about that, but at the same time, I think one of the reasons that productivity has been so bad since, well, it's over the long term, but also taken a dive since the financial crisis, is because wages fell. Labour became a lot cheaper relative to capital, and a lot of businesses who weren't really sure what to do were actually much more prepared to buy in some more workers who they could fire if it didn't really work out, and actually go and invest a lot in capital equipment. And I always use an example about my old firm KPMG, where they much preferred not changing your laptop and in doing some IT investment. They much preferred you spent an hour a day trying to get your laptop to start up and work properly because we were cheaper than doing the investment. So I think there's also some, I don't think it's just totally straightforward what's wrong. And I think the broader things people say on productivity about, well, you need to get the infrastructure better, we need more training, we need more apprenticeship training, I think still hold. But, as I say, this is obviously not something which the government has really been prepared to address, and I'm not really sure that if whatever happens with Brexit, I'm not sure. I'd like to think that they'll be forced to, but I'm not sure. Prospects of public spending, well, I'm afraid that whatever the noise is coming out of the Conservative Party, I really don't think they're suddenly going to go into a big fiscal expansion. The point I would make on this is that it's been very convenient to blame the Bank of England, but of course the Bank of England's done really all it could in getting interest rates down to zero, and the reason Mrs May ought to have understood why interest rates are so low is because fiscal policy's been so tight. So I'd welcome some easing, but I'm not convinced that's going to happen.
If at this stage I could go out...
Just one other point, which kind of ties in with something Phil was saying in a way. Nothing has been stopping businesses going out and selling around the world up till now. Just because we've been in the EU doesn't mean that you can't go and sell. And I just think businesses ought to concentrate on that in the future while this uncertainty is going on.
Very much. We've got about 5 minutes for questions, and then they're going to come back to the panel.
I'd just like to pick up on a question or a point that you made, Sam, about some of the measures that the Bank of England have been taking. And my question then is, are these measures perhaps feeding a short-term bubble, which at some point will burst, as all bubbles do, and how would that play out in the coming year or two?
Thanks very much.
And can I just ask a bit of a general futurist question, but 1st of November 2026, what are we likely to be reading in the Financial Times looking back to sort of Brexit in 2017?
Thanks very much. If we could take the mic to Stuart Abrahams there.
Thanks. Just one simple question. Does Brexit mean Brexit, or will we be told we actually did get it wrong and somehow, by fair means or foul, have to revote?
Thank you.
I'd just like to ask about the panel's views on productivity. I know Phil mentioned a load of countries that have better productivity than the UK, but what I noticed about those countries that you named is they work less hours than the UK does. So actually, how much is the productivity deficit in the UK a real problem, and how much is it just the fact that we work Sundays and our brothers and sisters in France don't?
Recently, Apple raised their price for £100 for a MacBook Air 13-inch, and then MacBook Pro for £300. They blame on Brexit. So do you think it's a right to blame Brexit for their price rising? And also, do you think that is the trend in the future, that all the external companies are going to charge us more?
I was at an economics talk the other day where there was the conversation was saying that the economists had actually got it wrong, and everything was being reported that the economists had got it wrong, but they were blaming it on the politics. Now, we can't afford to have a country that's run by two major groups of people who are blaming each other for getting it wrong for the future. So are those leading economists, in fact, able to do the job that we need in the future? And if not, where do we find the new economists from? And how do we control economics and politics in a way that enables business to grow?
Obviously, the focus of today has been about Britain post-Brexit, but it would be good to get your opinions on the future for Europe and posit the suggestion that an orderly Brexit is desirable to a disorderly sort of disintegration, which could very well happen in the EC in the next 10 years.
Thank you. Yes.
I think the choice seems to be right now between a hard Brexit and a soft Brexit. Do we think we'll be given the opportunity to choose between the two? And what is the difference between a soft Brexit and the position we're in already?
I'm going to ask the panellists to speak in the order that they started with. So Andrew, Rosa, Sam, and then Phil. If there's one thing, if you were able to also pick up, for those of you who haven't yet, on Caroline's question around what advice would you give to the businesses in this room about what they could practically do post-Brexit? Andrew, could we start with you?
Well, I'll try and remember what the questions were. Does Brexit mean Brexit? I mean, there's this breakfast issue, isn't there? And I say Brexit means dog's breakfast. So I think it'll be a total mess. I think, you know, what we'll read looking backwards will probably be, I mean, you know, the world's not going to end. It's just going to get a lot more difficult for us. And I think expectations will gradually come down. So in 10 years' time, we'll probably be saying it wasn't so bad after all. And don't forget, a lot of the, what we're talking about in terms of damage to the UK economy is actually slower growth, not big declines in output. We're just talking about you losing out on a lot which you would otherwise have had. And of course we had the same arguments then about, well, actually, you know, productivity growth down to 1% sort of issue, but that's nothing to do with Brexit. So I think it's, you know, I think the verdict will probably be where it was all right on the night, even if it wasn't. Yeah, I mean, this is what happens in terms of apple prices when you have a large depreciation of the currency. Either the producer or someone's going to have to take it on their margin, which doesn't often happen, or the price is going to go up in sterling terms, and that's what we're going to see a lot more of. And it's, you know, Marmite might not have gone up in Tesco, but it's gone up in a lot of other shops. So that will feed through. I mean, it's just impossible to believe it won't. The future of Europe, I mean, obviously it's a huge issue. My own feeling is if it survives, and I suspect it will survive, is that we might end up with this kind of two-tier, an inner core and outer core of Europe. I think what we've always done in the UK is not understood the politics within continental Europe and their desire, which you saw with Greece as well, to keep the show on the road for political reasons. So I'm not expecting the whole thing to implode. I just think the politics won't allow for that for the time being. Oh yes, the hard and soft. Yeah, I mean, I think what you're seeing at the moment, and we've got this funny thing going on with the car manufacturers and this sort of odd deal, I think what we're seeing at the moment is an attempt to construct as closely as we possibly can the arrangements we've got, which we've just said we don't want anymore. So I think, yeah, I mean, I think soft interpretation is it's pretty close to what we've got. Hard is just, well, we don't have any trade relationships with anybody, so we probably look at tariff barriers, or there's this idea we can unilaterally cut our own tariffs to zero, in which case everybody would say, well, thanks very much, we're not doing that though. So, yeah, anyway, that's it.
Any final bit of advice for companies trying to navigate this dog's breakfast?
Well, as I said, I mean, I think, you know, go and. I mean, you know, the reason that you don't trade so much with other markets, there's this whole gravity thing, but you are naturally going to trade with big markets. But there's cost, obviously, of going out and looking for other markets. Well, you're going to have to ideally bear some of those costs.
Thank you. Rosa.
Okay, to speed through, I'm going to start with the 1st of November 2026. Actually, the world's carrying on. It's continuing to turn. Astonishing, I know. I think that we will, well, this is what I want to see a reduction in the UK trade deficit that currently exists with Europe, but will certainly still be a significant trading partnership. Quite what the framework for that partnership might look like, I do not know, but proximity will continue to matter. But Brexit, yes, does mean Brexit. I don't have a crystal ball. If I had one, I might have been tempted to use it last night rather than today, but from where we stand, we're heading out. On productivity, I think that what we need to start doing is making sure that we have the right systems in place to fund good quality innovation and to make sure that firms have the ability to access the finance that they need for innovation. And actually, I think that what we need to do to accompany that funding for innovation is to make sure that we are encouraging small and growing businesses towards the very best business practices, because I think that that is very often where we fall down when it comes to productivity. Price rises and Brexit, the Yorkshire woman in me says firms will, of course, use any opportunity that they can to cloak price rises at times, but there is undoubtedly going to be a price rise that is associated with a currency fluctuation, and we simply have to ride that. I think, though it does give us opportunities to build those export partnerships while our currency is low. Of course, longer term, you need both the imports and the exports to survive. Hard versus soft, I haven't got a clue what those two terms mean. I think that they are press language that means very, very little indeed. What I do know is that we're going to make damn sure that we negotiate the best possible deal for the UK. Hard versus soft? No idea.
Thank you. Sam.
I really hate when you get 8 questions, all of which you really want to answer. On the point about QE, really, and low rates leading to a bubble, I wrote about this on the Adam Smith Institute blog last week. In short, I don't actually see the mechanism that many people think exists that QE should, in particular, go into asset prices. And I think it's much more likely to be because QE does avoid loss of GDP, loss of, basically it does prevent wealth destruction when you do it at the right time, and as a result we would expect asset prices to rise very quickly in anticipation of 50 years, let's say, or whatever the time horizon of an investor is, of lost wealth being forgone. So I don't see that, but it's very, very interesting and complex subject to go into now. On MacBook prices, to do with, I had been holding out for 2 years to buy a new MacBook. I'm very, very annoyed about the £500 price rise. Part of that is Brexit, part of that is obviously just natural price rises that they have gone for. But it's interesting to understand why. And I think the two different components of depreciation and devaluation, I suspect devaluation, an actual reduction in the future profitability of the UK economy or real interest rates falling, is the primary reason for the pound becoming weaker. Economists, have they got it wrong? I would compare it to a storm that a lot of meteorologists have predicted. Right now we're an hour past the forecast and the storm hasn't arrived yet. I wouldn't yet fire all the meteorologists. I would say let's wait and see. Let's not throw out all the models that we've got because they're pretty good models. They might be wrong here, but 1 quarter's worth of data isn't enough to throw out those models. The really big question really is hard versus soft, or does Brexit mean Brexit? I was a Remainer, having been a Leaver for some time. I decided to vote Remain, and I encouraged my friends to do so. Obviously, I speak on behalf of myself rather than the ASI, which doesn't take a position on this. But I think that the biggest cost in terms of people who care about the single market and who care about having a normal trading relationship with Europe has been Remainers who haven't yet come to terms with what's happened. Wolfgang Munchau wrote this, and I think he's completely right, that the big shift towards hard Brexit, which I think means leaving the single market and potentially relying on WTO rules, has been because Brexiteers are terrified that somehow soft Brexit or Remainers people will be able to reverse the decision. I think the quicker people like me accept the decision and say, how do we make this work? And part of that, I think, is remaining in the single market while leaving the EU, the quicker we will get a sensible deal that isn't cutting off our noses to spite our face and isn't people who write for The Telegraph, who used to be cabinet ministers, saying that the Bank of England governor should resign because he said something negative about Brexit in the run-up to the referendum. I think there's a slight madness that's taken hold on both sides, and the quicker Remainers kind of come to terms with what's happened and come to their senses, the quicker we can start having a rational and sensible adult discussion about this. I think it's very important that we focus on non-tariff barriers, not just the taxes that are imposed on us, but the regulations that block our ability to trade with EU countries. That's what the single market is about. And if we're to not make Brexit a failure, if we're to actually avoid a significant loss of wealth, which could happen, I think the key thing is to come to terms with it and try to focus on maintaining a single market trading relationship as we leave the EU. It's Remainers that have to do that, because otherwise those hard Brexit, those Brexiteers are probably rationally going to go for the hardest possible leave they can go for, and that's going to hurt everybody.
Thank you. Sam. Phil.
Endorse what my fellow panelists said. There's some wonderful questions there which we can't possibly do justice to in no time at all. Will Brexit mean Brexit? Obviously that's the key one. I am very worried that Brexit is not going to happen. I think that's why there is this manufactured discussion between hard Brexit and soft Brexit, which people have all sorts of interpretations of. But it's being put in the air there in order to justify a shift towards watering it down to pretty much, as was said, pretty much the same as what we have at the moment. Brexit, we have to see, is not an economic question. It is a democratic question, right? It was put to the vote, whether you agree or disagree with the fact that Cameron decided to do that, but a vote was put, which was very clear, as to whether to be in the EU or to leave the EU, and the majority of people voted for it. That's a democratic question. It has been resolved and is now up to the government to implement that. And I say my main concern is that, as you can evidence from the little bits of snippets which we get coming out from what is actually going on behind the scenes, one could dissect the discussion about Nissan to one's heart content, but there's clearly something going on. And it expresses what I think is not just peculiar to this government, but I think it's been a feature of Western political life over the last 30 years, really, which is that there is a discomfort with change, to put it very simply, that people prefer, politicians prefer just to keep things the way they are. Stability has replaced economic growth and dynamism, in my mind, to put it very crudely. Instead of having growth policies mixed with stability, which, because we all say we like stability, stability has dominated, and there's been an attempt in lots of different ways to actually restrain change. And that's why I think there's a fear among some people about Brexit, because Brexit is enforced change. The people have spoken, we're leaving something. Brexit, in my mind, it means leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, because what people voted for was an ability for decisions about life in Britain to be made in Britain. And that is non-compatible with being a member of the single market and being a member of the customs union where tariffs are imposed by elsewhere, or the tariffs you have to charge elsewhere. So it has to mean leaving. But because of this cultural discomfort with change and this desire to maintain stability and maintain things the way they are, there's this great risk of it being watered down to meaninglessness, which is why the Brexit campaign isn't over. It's not just a matter of Remainers having to accept what's been decided and be part of building a better future. But the popular debate, which wasn't very well led at all, well, it was poorly led from the top over the referendum campaign from both sides, but that sense of engagement of people, that sense of being involved in something, that sense of voting, and many people have voted for the first time in their lives because they actually felt their vote counted in something, that sense of making a difference is something which I think needs to be maintained and focused around a national conversation, a national debate about economic renewal. That's what I'd say. Brexit forces changes. And I think the first thing that Britain needs is change in terms of the economy, because the current economy, the current status quo economy is an abysmal one. So if this Brexit shock, which has been voted upon, is a way of shaking things up and actually saying we've got to do something and make some changes, that will be a good thing. But our political class at the moment, say nothing personalised on them because it's been the same with their predecessors, are going to be resistant to making those changes, which is why I think and that would be politically an extremely explosive situation, which I don't think in number 10 realises that if that's the way it comes through, that some form of manufactured soft Brexit is the outcome. All right, one piece of advice. All right, piece of advice for business. I think Caroline also has a piece of advice for government. For business, I think alongside this sort of culture of avoiding change and reluctance to change, I think a parallel cultural feature of life in Britain and in other Western countries has been a sort of an extreme short-termism, which afflicts government, but I think it also afflicts us in day-to-day lives. We as business people, I've run businesses, are not immune to that sort of short-termist sort of muddling through approach. So the one piece of advice I think I give to myself as a business leader and to other businesses is stop just trying to cope and survive for the next 2 to 3 years. We've got to begin to look longer term and begin to see that in order to survive, we have to change as businesses and as an economy in general. So think longer term and don't just think about the next 18, 24, 30, 36 months. And to government, I say that they have created this, or they have gone along with this mess of productivity. And I think in one word, I'd go along with what you've said, that they should get to grips with the productivity problem. I think they should instruct Rosa and others in the trade departments and say, right, you guys, you're the experts, go out and get the freest trade deals you can with the rest of Europe and with the rest of the world. You're the experts, go off and do it. And we as British politicians should focus on the things we have more direct control over than the outcome of speculative negotiations. That is to deal with this productivity problem. What are we doing as a government? What policies are we implementing at the moment which is actually stopping businesses investing, which is what is undermining productivity? What is it in the insolvency regime? What is it in ultra-low interest rates which are propping up zombie businesses? What is it in working tax credits which are subsidising low pay in this country? And various things. They should do an audit of everything that the government is responsible and has control over, and perhaps the things it will have even more control over in 2 years' time when it leaves the EU, and what can we do to stop doing things which are propping up a zombie low productivity economy, and then let businesses and people in general get on with creating a more productive future.
Thank you very much, Phil. If we could thank all of the panel now.